This is Kat Klingon-Smith with the Retro Crime. This story is a bit of a doozy. I enjoy it, though. In December of 1929, the bullet-ridden, beat-up body of a 31-year-old man was found in Forest Hills, Pennsylvania, southeast of Pittsburgh. The police checked for identification and were confused to find two sets. His name was David Sturtz and David Strehler. Later, at the undertaker's, a small brunette woman in black arrived and introduced herself as Thelma Sturtz. She had been married to David since she was 16 years old. Then an even smaller brunette woman in black arrived and introduced herself as Hazel Strehler. She had also been married to David since she was 16 years old. This was the first time meeting since the police informed them that their husband was dead. David's boss arrived to identify the body. He owned a car company, and David had been working as his mechanic for the past couple of years. It was his car that David was killed in and later found abandoned. David had lost his prior job at a garbage plant for being a police informant after telling authorities that he installed a moonshine still for them that was using garbage to make liquor. It led to exposing the Pittsburgh Mafia for using garbage trucks with false bottoms to transport it. His boss said that he never took David for someone women would be interested in. He didn't even know his name was David. He had only called him Sturtz. David had married 29-year-old Thelma 13 years prior, and they had 3 kids together. Their middle child died of diphtheria at 3 years old. David came home on weekends with enough groceries to last for the week. The kids thought that their dad worked in Connellsville during the week, and it was too long of a commute. Connellsville, by the way, is 38 miles south of them. But he was a good dad. He often popped in during the week to see them. When the police visited Thelma to ask about the murder, she insisted that he was a good man and always paid the rent, which was $19 a month. I thought, well, that must be a lot back in 1929. Nope, that's less than $400 now. Thelma claimed she thought David was rarely home because he was dodging bill collectors. She was wearing a threadbare coat in December in a shabby house, yet stood by her story of David being a good provider and showed them her cabinets filled with groceries. Then it was time for the police to pay a visit to David's other wife, Hazel. David had married 18-year-old Hazel 19 months prior. They lived in the small town of Zelienople, that's 38 miles north. Hazel couldn't and wouldn't believe that her husband had a double life. She had met David when she was 15 and he was 28. 3 months later, she turned 16 and they were married by a justice of the peace in his friend's home. David was able to marry Thelma at 16 because they were married in West Virginia. A lot of people in these podcast episodes married in West Virginia because state registration of birth didn't start until 1917. Thelma and David had been married in 1916. They both claimed that they were 22 years old. As far as Hazel, they weren't legally married anyway, but he may have told her that the legal age to marry was 16 because it was and still is the age of consent, although there are some stipulations. Hazel's husband was allegedly spending weekends in town visiting his 10-year-old son David Jr., whose mother Thelma had died 3 years ago. Hazel insisted that David was a good man and a good provider. He may have seemed that way because Hazel's dad had died from lung cancer right before she met David, and her mother was stuck with 5 kids, with Hazel being the oldest at 15. As far as David having 2 sets of ID, he told the woman who washed his pants he needed it for work because his license was suspended. The women learned that when Thelma was done reading magazines, David would bring them to Hazel. When he would bring home a confusing assortment of groceries, it was because he got the grocery list mixed up. I can only imagine if Jason brought home a parsnip, I would be utterly confused. I don't know what to do with a parsnip. The women tolerated each other kindly and planned the funeral service together. The Reverend wasn't as tactful and said at the funeral, I quote here, "This is the saddest funeral at which I have officiated. I will take as my text, 'It is appointed and commanded once to die. After that, the judgment.' This man died as a violator of the 6th commandment without the blood of Jesus to wash him clean." Wow. That's nice, Reverend. This man that these women are mourning, they can see him again in hell. The investigation grew cold. Reporters got it out of Thelma that actually she did know that he was shacking up with another woman during the week, but she didn't know that they were married. Both of the wives were broken records about David being a good man and a good provider. Not good enough to provide them with a dictionary to look up good provider, I guess, or provide Thelma with one and give it to Hazel when she was done. With the wives no longer being suspects, the police detectives looked towards the mob as potential murderers because of David being an informant. They were skeptical, but there wasn't much else to go on. Other than being a bigamist and a snitch, David wasn't too interesting. He grew up in a working-class family. His dad was a German immigrant who slowly drank himself to death, and by slowly, I mean he finally died from cirrhosis at 78 from, his death certificate says, intoxicating beverages. I found out his mother had a strong lisp and lots of kids over a 20-year span, but none of that screams payback. The case went cold until almost exactly 8 years later. A 35-year-old man in prison named Tony Romanski was a third of his way through a 12-year sentence for robbery. He had been arrested 4 years prior after being shot during a robbery. When his stuff was inspected, they discovered his name on his watch. In small letters, it said Tony Romanski. He was the leader of the Romanski gang. Law enforcement had been able to incarcerate 5 of his men for highway robbery, but Tony remained elusive. He was powerful and dangerous. He had his gang lock up the chief of police to rescue one of their enforcers named Steve Muchin, or Mooch as he was called. Mooch was arrested with their guy John Mixer. John was quickly moved to an unknown jail to avoid the gang returning and breaking him out as well. Then in November of 1937, Tony began acting jumpy. He wasn't sleeping. The warden moved his job at the penitentiary to one where the guards could keep their eyes on him at all times. One day in December, Tony had enough. He demanded to speak with the warden. What he told him was something so unexpected, the warden didn't believe him immediately. I wouldn't have either. Tony started off with, "The ghost in my cell won't leave me alone." Okay then. They for a month and wouldn't give him any rest until he confessed to murdering them. He confessed that in 1929, he, John Mixer, and Mooch had been up to their usual highwayman antics. They wanted David Sturtz's fancy car he was driving that belonged to David's boss. People are generally agreeable once they see a gun, but David Sturtz wasn't. I think he was more afraid of pissing his boss off if he lost the car, so he fought back. As a result, he got shot and dumped over a wall in the snow. Now, David had joined Tony in Western Penitentiary to torture him psychologically. The other ghost pestering Tony was Patrick Craig. They couldn't keep driving the same stolen car, so when they abandoned David's, they posed as hitchhikers and waited for a good Samaritan. Patrick picked them up, and his dad reported him missing as soon as his car was found abandoned. The police had no record of his murder, but Tony insisted that they had killed him and knew his name from his ID in his pocket. Good thing Patrick only had one ID. Mooch had killed Patrick in cold blood, and out of remorse, Tony and John went back and buried him in a shallow grave. The police were skeptical, but after some searching, an officer found an old missing persons report. Meanwhile, John Mixer was living in Detroit and was surprised when the police barged in and brought him to Pennsylvania. He refused to speak until he had a private meeting with Tony. Maybe he still feared Tony as his leader, or maybe Tony told him he would get a light sentence because only Tony and Mooch had pulled the triggers. In any case, John gave a full confession. Mooch, however, was nowhere to be found. Rumor was that he was heading out on the West Coast. Tony and John took them to Patrick's grave, and after Patrick's dentist verified that it was him through dental records, the Craig family was notified. They were surprised because they had no idea Patrick was dead. I honestly don't know what other conclusions they came to. His 20-year-old brother said, I'm going to quote him here, "My brother went hunting 8 years ago, and I don't know who was with him. He didn't tell us. Later, we were told the family auto was found near McKeesport. There were no license plates on it. We never thought anything happened to him. We thought that he left home and disappeared." Okay, logical conclusion. Maybe he ran off with the mafia in a garbage truck. and who knows. In 1941, so about 4 years later, a woman in Montana who enjoyed true crime got one of her crime magazines in the mail. It featured the bigamous murder of 1929. She was shocked to see a picture of a local man. She went to the police and showed them the picture of Steve Muchin, known to them as Jack Thompson. He was returned to Pennsylvania, and all three of them were given life sentences. I like to follow through on the main characters in these stories. Since they're historic crimes, there's already an aftermath. Tony Romanski seemed to have vanished. I spent way too much time trying to figure out what happened to him and felt defeated. I told Jason about how I was stumped, and he said, oh, he probably had neurosyphilis. Al Capone had a ghost named Jimmy. Sure enough, Tony had been sent to a home for the aged on Welfare Island in New York, which is now Roosevelt Island. He was the only inmate in his 40s and didn't seem to live much longer after that. He wasn't the only one struggling with mental health. John Mixer was sent to an insane asylum and lived until the ripe age of 80. In the 34 years since his passing, no one has claimed his ashes. Steve Muchin escaped and ran off to Washington State. He lived in a hotel on and off in a small town near Idaho and was found dead at 66 from a brain hemorrhage. No autopsy was done, no underlying condition was given, and no recognition of it being an accident or natural death. His death certificate is pretty much a list of aliases, the hotel he was living at, and that he had been at large since 1922 for deserting the armed forces. He was buried in an Oddfellows cemetery, so he had a hobby besides armed robbery. I'm not surprised that's the fraternity he belonged to. A lot of haunted places we've been to have been associated with them. They do something with skeletons. My theory is that the owners of the bones want their bodies buried. As for the wives, they survived without their quote-unquote good provider. Hazel got involved with another married man. I doubt he would have left his wife for her, they almost never do, but his wife had enough sense to kick her cheating husband to the curb. She filed a petition for divorce, and when it was finalized, Hazel was able to marry legally this time. She got lucky. A lot of people waste their best-looking years on dreams that won't come true. Thelma found work as a servant and had to live separately from her kids for a little while until she got on her feet. They were soon reunited. She was 29 when her husband died, then lived another 29 years without remarrying. I admire Thelma a lot. She learned how to be her own provider while the kids were still young enough for her to be an example to them. I met my husband in my late 30s, and I'm glad it wasn't earlier because I needed my early 30s to continue learning how to be independent, to rely on myself. I discovered that grown-ups have the freedom to make choices in a way that kids can't. Like, they can choose to eat brownies for breakfast. They can also choose to get the help they need to heal and have happy lives. No one can stop them. My mom would say, you are captain of your own ship. As I grew, I learned that maturity is pretty much fixing our own ship no matter who or what broke it. Choosing to grow is hard. It was hard for me in modern times with opportunities that Thelma didn't have. I cannot imagine how exponentially more difficult it was for her and all women facing these challenges in the 1930s. Thelma didn't even have living parents or sisters nearby. The hole she climbed out of was just as high and steep as climbing a mountain. She was a mother, chose to be courageous, and did everything it took to take care of her kids. Thelma Sturtz filled her own cupboards and became a hero.